Dr. Stein is the Associate Department Head for Horticulture at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. He's out in Uvalde, but I understand you probably spend a lot of time in College Station.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and he specializes in pecans, fruits, and vegetables. So long-time career in extension, certainly experienced. And we appreciate that. Appreciate you being here this morning to talk to us about vegetable fertilization. Again, if you have questions, you can drop them in the chat, or we'll leave some time at the end to answer those questions. But with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Stein.
All right. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Great to be here. We're going to talk a little bit about vegetable fertilization today, which is going to apply to a lot of different crops. Obviously, you're looking at a field of cabbage here, a commercial field of cabbage, very well developed frame, which is what you need to develop to get a good head on cabbage. And so we're going to talk about the basics of fertilizers today. We'll talk about different types. We'll talk about soil tests. We'll talk about foliar fertilizers. And so we'll cover a wide range of topics this morning that will hopefully help you in some of your operations. The most important thing you need to realize about fertilizers, though, is they're not miracle products. You know, there's a lot of people say, we'll just throw some fertilizer on it and that'll cure the problem. But, you know, you got to realize that nutrition is just one of the components of a sound production program. And so you have to have all these other things in place. They have to be all right for fertilizer to actually do some good. Realize it takes some 20 essential chemical elements to grow plants. You know, a lot of people always forget about the big four: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. That's 95% of the plant solids. I mean, basically, you're getting these three from the atmosphere, and then nitrogen is a big one that is often lacking. And then you have these other 16. But realize the one that it's lacking, I mean, if it's 20, you know, I was talking to a nutrition person the other day, and so I said, well, how many are essential today? You know, you have all these textbooks that add some. And he said, well, I only consider like 13, you know. And so he didn't include the first three, you know, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And so then you have some here that are in less that you don't often hear about: cobalt, sodium, silicon, and different things. But realize all of these are important. The plants need all 16 in order to grow and develop. And if one is lacking, then that's going to be the problem that you have to deal with. And so what we like to do to start out is do a soil test. I mean, if you've never done one, you need to do one. Realize soil testing is not exact science. You know, a lot of people like to test the soil. Well, we need to apply this and this and this, and you do that, you go out there and do that, and everything's hunky-dory. And as you well know, that's not often the case. But it does give us some good baseline data where we're at, where we need to potentially be, etc. Now realize the soil test sample, the results that you get back are only as good as the sample that you take. And I personally like to sample from 1 to 6 and from 6 to 12 inches. So I get 2 plastic buckets, I get a sharpshooter shovel here, and then I'm going to take a minimum of 8 to 10 subsamples across the field. And the other thing you have to figure out is when you look at your field is the color of the soil all the same type in the entire field. You may have black land over here, you may have yellow soil over here, and so obviously those are 2 different soil types, and you would need to sample them separately. So what I do is with my sharpshooter shovel, I'll dig down 6 inches. I'll slice a piece off of soil from 1 to 6. It goes into the 1 to 6 bucket. I dig that same hole down to 12 inches, sample a piece of soil from 6 to 12, and it goes in the other bucket. And then, like I said, I'll do that 8 to 10 spots across the field so that I get a very uniform sample of the field. If you have time and can get more samples than that, you're going to get a better read of what you really have out in that field. And so if you've never done one, you need to do one of those so that you get a good idea of what kind of baseline data you have out there in that field. Realize fertilizers are salts. And the amount of salt that you have is going to vary with the type of fertilizer. Realize that if you put too much fertilizer out there, water is going to move out of the plant. It's going to burn the leaves. So fertilizer can be good, too much, not as good, too close can be an issue. So here is a situation where there is a pecan. This guy used some liquid fertilizer put around the pecan tree. You see it ran out here into the wheat intercrop there. And so what's happening is that water out of the plants, out of the wheat, is trying to neutralize the salt here on the ground. So instead of the water moving into the plant, it's going to move out of the plant. And so that's why we tell you when you plant, you don't want to have a lot of nitrogen out there so that you don't create a situation here where you can create this type of situation. Didn't damage the tree, but it sure did damage the crop here. And so too much, too close can be an issue. And so you need to be aware of that. Realize the only reason fertilizers work is because of water. And so what water does is it moves it into the root zone. So you apply fertilizer, water moves it down into the root zone. Different fertilizers are very different, have different rates of solubility. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Like phosphorus doesn't move via water, but nitrogen does. So if all you need is nitrogen, you can put nitrogen on top. Quarter to a half inch of water will take it right into the soil and you will be good. So water moves the nitrogen into the root zone. It moves it from the root zone to the root, and it moves from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. And so if we go back to this picture right here, typically the water concentration outside the plant is higher than it is inside the plant. And so water goes like this. Well, in this case, the water concentration is actually higher in the plants than it is in the ground. And so that's why the water moving to neutralize this salt right here. And so that's the gist of what's happening with this higher concentration to the lower concentration. Realize also that many years you see nutrient deficiencies on your plants, but it may just be a drought problem. You know, if you don't have the water to move the nutrients into the ground and into the plant, well, then you're going to have a nutrient deficiency. And so be aware that water is a real critical part of the process. Now, plants have a lot of roots, you know, but a lot of those roots are just to support the plant. So realize it's only the top 3 to 6 inches of the soil that has really good oxygen. And so that's where your new growing root tips are going to be. It's only those new growing root tips that are going to take up the water and nutrients. And so realize that these roots constantly die and regenerate. And so oxygen, though, is the real key to getting water absorption as well as fertility absorption. So we talk about water. You got to get your water right. Here we're using sprinkler to irrigate this vegetable crop. Sprinklers are okay to use on certain crops. We worry about disease issues if you keep it wet at night, but realize sprinkler is a system that can work. Most of the time we advocate drip irrigation to keep the foliage wet, but realize that sprinkler can be used. Here is a situation where we have poorly drained soil though. So here we have drip irrigation, but you see how the soil is saturated. And so when this soil is saturated, those plants are going to die. Here's a shot of carrots in a poorly drained soil that's saturated, and you see how they're starting to yellow. And so realize the symptoms for too much water are the exact same symptoms as for not enough water. So here we have too much water, and it's causing these plants to die. And so if you have too much water in your soil, the plant can't take up water, can't take up nutrients. And so you have to walk a fine line there of when you're looking at nutrition and water so that you have your water situation right so your plants can take up both the water and the nutrition. You know, the other thing that amazes me at times is people forget about the influences of weeds. So, they call you up and they say, well, I need fertilizer on my crop of peas here. But in reality, you have the weeds here, they're getting the fertility that's in the field. And so realize that weeds are going to take away from the fertility that your crop can potentially get. You know, weeds are a big issue. And so weed control needs to be a primary part of your situation so that then your plants can get the nutrients they need. And so weed control, number one in a sound production program. Realize also environment has a great influence on how these plants perform. And sometimes you may think that's a fertilizer issue, but in reality, it's environmental. Like these tomatoes in cages with the plastic wrap. You create a greenhouse situation, and these plants tend to outgrow these probably 2 to 1. So here is caged with plastic, non-caged. And so here is the difference in plant growth. And so you see, you get a bigger plant here, and you may equate that to nutrition, but in reality, all that was an environmental situation there. So that can influence the fertility as well. Last thing is we think about cool season crops as not needing, say, warmth to make them grow well. So in the spring, a lot of times we use plastic to warm up the soil and get better growth. Well, here is a cool season crop. This is spinach growing on plastic covered beds. Here are spinach plants. This is the same variety here with not plastic, and see the difference in growth there. And same is true here. And so a lot of times we think about temperature on warm season crops, but it can be have an effect on cool season crops as well. But this is a purely environmental and not a nutritional aspect. And so we need to keep those things in mind, that there's other things that influence the way plants respond to nutrition. One of the challenges that we have is a lot of times people tend to maybe fertilize too much. And so you got to realize that excess fertilizer can create a bad situation. You can get too much vigor on your plants, especially on things like black-eyed peas, so that you get all plant and no pods. You can get delayed ripening. Too much nitrogen on tomatoes. I've seen it this year on broccoli plants, where broccoli had excess of fertility, and you get a lot of plant, you get a head, but the head is buried down deep in the plant, and so that can be an issue. Realize phosphorus can be a challenge because it ties up iron and zinc, and so if you over apply phosphorus, that can be a challenge, and so that's why we like to do the soil test. Over the years, there's been a lot of triple 13 thrown out there, meaning that you have the same amount of nitrogen as phosphorus as potassium. And I'm fixing to show you a picture here directly that indicates that plants use these nutrients in ratios. And so we'll talk about that here in a second. Also, you have to realize that plants have to keep these anions and cations in balance. And so these different nutrients have charges, like potassium has plus, calcium has +2, magnesium has a plus. And so if you over apply calcium, then the plant doesn't take up enough of the others. And so keeping it in balance is real important. And so you don't want to do one over another. You want to keep it in balance. And so that's why we encourage you to do the soil test, so that you don't overdo one or the other. As I was telling you a while ago, typically plants use nutrients in a 3:1:2 ratio. 3:1:2 ratio. So here we're looking at ornamental plants, and when you look at the composition of the plant, the percent nitrogen ranges from 2 to 6, percent phosphorus 0.2 to 0.7, percent potassium 1.5 to 3.5. When you look at fruits, very similar numbers, very similar numbers. When you look at vegetable crops, very similar numbers. And so when you apply fertilizers, typically we're looking at a 3:1:2 ratio is what you need to be putting out there. Now, if you've never done a soil test, and you don't know what your soil pH is, and your soil pH is high, if you're 7.8 to 8.2, then you may not need this 3:1:2 ratio. But if you know where your soil pH is, if you're 7.5 and below, typically we recommend a 3:1:2 ratio fertilizer initially, and then we'll come back and side dress nitrogen. we want to get away from this notion of using a 13, 13, 13. We want to use something more like 15, 5, 10, because that's in the ratio that these plants are using the nutrients that we're after. So in order to get the most out of our fertilizer application, we need to know which nutrients we need to apply based on our soil test and crop. We need to make timely applications, and we're fixing to talk about that. And we also need to make accurate placement, and that's something that we want to talk about in a little bit more detail as well. Soil type will dictate frequency of application. So realize all soils are not created equal, and you need to know what kind of soil you have. Realize the heavier soils. Here is a Houston black clay type soil. Holds a lot of nutrition. It's a very fertile soil. The challenge you have with these soils obviously is soil drainage. So here we're growing a melon crop on this type of soil. You wouldn't think of that soil as being a very good melon crop soil, but I'm here to tell you that field will roll out the cantaloupes because of the fertility that the soil has. And the only challenge you may have is if the soil gets wet, you may get a little bit of belly rot. But this farmer up in McKinney, Texas, grew Plano County, grew cantaloupe for years and did extremely well with cantaloupe. And like I said, these soils hold a lot of fertility. Whereas a sandier type soil, this is a sandy loam, even some blow sands right here, they're not going to hold nutrition as your heavier soils do. And so you're going to have to side dress these plants a lot more frequently than you will those plants on the blackland type soils. So this is a watermelon crop. We start to side dress them when the vines go to running. This is what we call running, and obviously we're going to put that fertilizer right here. We'll talk about water as moving the fertilizer into the ground here in a second as well. So as a general rule of thumb, when we get ready to fertilize a field, if we're going to plant a crop, we've done a soil test. And so typically what we're going to do is we're going to put out the required phosphorus and potassium before planting. We'll put out usually a quarter to maybe half of the nitrogen. So typically it's like I'm telling you, a 3-1-2 application that we're going to broadcast over the field. Better situation would be to band, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But we don't need to put a lot of nitrogen out here because of that deal I told you about a while ago about burning our roots and pulling the water out of the plants. And so we want to be careful about that. Realize the best way to apply phosphorus and potassium is to band it. And the most ideal placement is 2 inches below the seed. And so realize when you broadcast, you spread it out over the entire field. And when you do that, what you're creating there is a situation where the phosphorus and potassium can get tied up by the calcium, and realize the phosphorus can also tie up the iron and zinc that's in the soil. And so if you can avoid broadcasting, if you have the ability to band, it's far superior to broadcasting. Now I visit with some farmers and they tell me, well, I just don't have time to band it. And so they go ahead and broadcast and band it up. And you know, they make it work. But what I'm here to tell you is if you could broadcast it here with these knives, if you can knife it right into the bed, if you're on 40s, 80s, whatever you're on, if you could do that, that's a much better situation because the phosphorus is going to be right there. Here are these knives. You're putting it right there in the bed, like on a 40-inch bed, probably right down the middle is where you would put it. You're planting 2 lines on a 40, or if you're on 80 with 8 lines on an 80 or 4 lines on an 80 or whatever, you have a pump that's putting out that fertilizer, and so you're going to get a specific amount, and that way you don't have to worry about working that phosphorus and potassium into the soil. If you don't incorporate phosphorus and potassium into the soil, they're not going to move down, especially phosphorus. You know, phosphorus moves very, very little. And so if we can go ahead and incorporate bandit would be ideal. That will be the very best way to do that. Once we have our phosphorus and potassium out there and we get our plants to growing, then we're going to side dress nitrogen. Nitrogen's going to be what's going to make those plants grow. Like we said, frequency and amount dictated by whether we can incorporate or water it in. And realize small, frequent amounts are best. You know, the most ideal situation with nitrogen would be to apply some every week on a weekly basis would be ideal. You know, every week, say you put a little bit of nitrogen in there. It's just like when you buy transplants. Every time those plants are watered, there is fertilizer in that water. And so if you could do the same situation in your field, then that would be a very, very good situation. Now, some of us don't have the ability to apply our fertilizer, our nitrogen, and water it in. Maybe we have to wait on a rain. Maybe we can't incorporate it. And so the challenge that we have to worry with is the volatilization of ammonia when your soil pH is greater than 7.5. If you broadcast it out there and the soil is wet, you're going to lose 50 to 60% of that nitrogen. And so you need to be aware of that. If you're going to broadcast and water it in, make sure the soil is dry before you do that, unless you can turn the sprinklers on right behind you putting out the fertilizer, or if you're applying that fertilizer in a slight rain or mist, etc. When you look at nitrogen fertilizer choices, basically you have four. You have ammonium sulfate, you have ammonium nitrate, you have urea, and you have N32 or UAN. And realize N32 is a combination of urea and ammonium nitrate. The most available fertilizers on the market today typically are ammonium sulfate, urea, and N32. This one here is very hard to get because of the incident that happened in Oklahoma. So when you're looking at ammonium sulfate, typically you can buy ammonium sulfate cheaper, but realize it's only 21% nitrogen. So if you spread out 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate per acre, you're putting out 21 pounds of nitrogen over that acre. Whereas with ammonium nitrate, 33%, 33 pounds, and then urea is 42 to 45 pounds of nitrogen over that acre when you put out 100 pounds. And so typically when you do the math, urea is a better choice to buy because you're getting more nitrogen per dollar spent. And so you want to investigate that when you're investigating these different fertilizers. The other one that we talked about is N32. It is a liquid product. It's only 32% nitrogen. It's derived from urea and ammonium nitrate. The reason we like ammonium nitrate is ammonium nitrate is a stable fertilizer source when placed on the soil. And so if you had your choice, you can broadcast ammonium nitrate and you're not going to lose it to volatilization. And so that's why it's nice to have this in the mix. So you have, realize one gallon of N32 weighs 11 pounds. So it's 11 pounds of weight per gallon, but it's only 32% nitrogen. So 11 times 0.32 means you get 3.5 pounds of nitrogen per gallon of N32. And so those are the numbers that you can use to figure out exactly how many pounds you're applying per acre when you put out this liquid. So they make several injection systems. I mean, you can get an injection system that's run off the water. Here's a small, simple one that you can buy that you can use. There's Venturi systems. There's pumps where you're pumping the water into the line. And so if you can inject your fertilizer into your lines, you can probably save a quarter to about a half the amount of fertilizer that you may need. So if you can inject it into these drip lines, realize with drip irrigation, you're putting the water right where the plant needs it. So that means the nutrition is growing right there as well. And so drip incorporated into the water, fertilizer into the water is a very, very good system and one that we like a lot. I mean, here's a situation where we're growing high value crops. This is lettuce. You know, typically we don't try to grow head lettuce in Texas, but if you can grow head lettuce, it tends to get bitter, but if you can grow it, it's a high value crop and you can't afford to spend the dollars on the drip and developing a fertilizer injection system so that you can put the fertilizer exactly where the plants need it. So the next topic that we want to talk a little bit about are foliar fertilizers. And you know, there's been a lot of talk, there's a lot of people advocate for foliar fertilizers. But what I'm here to tell you is it's impossible to supply a significant portion of the macronutrient needs of most plants with foliar fertilizers. So realize plants have macronutrients and they have micronutrients. And so a while ago, we told you there's 16 nutrients that you need. And so about half of them are macronutrients. And so the plant needs a large amount of them. And so the big three are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, then calcium and magnesium. And so those are the big macros. And for you to try to put those on a leaf and get them into the plant, it's almost impossible, almost impossible. And so there's a lot of people that spend a lot of money on foliar fertilizers, and you're really not getting the bang for your buck. I know a lot of people use triple 13 as a foliar fertilizer. And in my mind, they're wasting their money with that particular product, because you're only going to get a little bit of nitrogen in and very little phosphorus and potassium. Now, the one thing that the triple 13 does in your spray tank is it helps lower the spray pH, and that's good. That's good. I mean, a lot of these different products that you use to control insects and diseases are pH sensitive, and so if you can lower the water pH, that will be a good thing. But what you have to realize is when you apply a nutrient on a leaf, and I tell most people that the good Lord designed leaves to do one thing and one thing only, and that's to capture light. You know, that's what leaves were developed for. They're designed to capture light. They're not designed to take up nutrients. Now, the thing about it is, though, you can get a little bit in. But the challenge to getting these nutrients into the leaf is you have to penetrate the cuticle. And the cuticle is that waxy layer on top of a leaf that keeps it from drying out. So without that, if you did not have this cuticle out there, the leaves basically would just burn up. So it's got to penetrate the cuticle. It has to move through the apoplast. And then you have to have absorption on the membrane surface. And then you have to have transport into the leaf cells. And so this is a complicated process. It's not as easy as it sounds. You know, you hear all these commercials about Miracle-Gro and spraying the leaves and all that. But what I'm here to tell you is, if it was simple, anybody could do it. And so just spraying it on the leaves doesn't mean that it's going to go in. So like I told you, cuticle is a major limiting factor to entry. Realize you do have the stomates, and y'all have all heard the talk about the stomates. The stomates are the openings on the leaves. They open, and when they open, water vapor goes out into the atmosphere, and CO2 comes in, and then the plant's able to use CO2 in the photosynthetic process. And so stomates are real important for plants, but realize you lose a tremendous amount of water. About 90% of the water that plants use is lost via the stomates. So stomates, when they're open, you do get some entry of these foliar fertilizers in there. You also have vein areas. Realize if you're going to use a foliar fertilizer, you want to spray the very young leaves, the very immature leaves. They don't have a fully developed cuticle yet, and so you're going to be able to get some more in. The key is that you don't have a very strong solution. It needs to be dilute so that you don't burn these leaves. You know, you can always tell when you're getting stuff into a plant, when you see leaf burn, that's not necessarily a good thing. You want to get the nutrients in without causing the leaf burn. These leaves also have trichomes. These are hairs. And so when that solution beads up in these trichomes, there are little hairs there that the solution can bead up there, and it's going to stay wet longer, and so you will get better absorption. And so the key role in absorption of foliar fertilizers is keeping the droplet wet for a long period of time. And so the best time to apply a foliar fertilizer or a nutrient that you're trying to get into the plant is when you have a fog or a drizzle or a heavy dew, because the plant leaves are extremely wet. And so what you want to do is you want to keep that solution wet for an extended period of time. And so when you're doing this, you do not want to use surfactants. Surfactants are soaps typically, and they lower the surface tension of water. And what they do is they cause the water to spread out over the leaf. And when the water spreads out over the leaf, it dries extremely fast. And that's not what you want. And so you need to not use these surfactants if you're trying to get foliar fertilizers into plants. A fun thing that you can try sometimes is, to mix up 2 tablespoons of a liquid Dawn or dishwashing soap into a sprayer. And when you have a heavy dew on your plants, go out there and spray those plants with that soap solution and see how the water slicks off the leaves. It's just amazing how it slicks off. And so when you're looking at drying plants out, a way you can dry them out, I mean, if you're having disease issues, is to use a surfactant to shed some of the water. But when you're trying to get stuff into the plant, you don't want to use a surfactant because it's going to dry extremely fast. So it's my thinking that foliar fertilizers are best used to supply micronutrients. So if you have an iron deficiency or you have a zinc deficiency, those are nutrients that you can get into the leaf. Now, with pecans, other crops, a lot of times we may put a little bit of nitrogen with that solution because the nitrogen tends to promote absorption. But as far as getting nitrogen in, you get a very limited amount in as a foliar fertilizer. Now, there's other things that affect nutrition as well. We talked some about the environment can affect it. We talked about weeds infecting the environment. But also when you incorporate things into your soil, you can create a soil environment that's not favorable to plant growth. So here is a raised bed. These are strawberries. And in my mind, these strawberries are tremendously hungry. So there's 2 issues that could be causing this problem. One is, actually maybe 3. One is there's absolutely no fertilizer applied here, which is not the case. They did apply fertilizer. Second thing could be is it's a poorly drained situation. So if you have a poorly drained situation, the plants can't take up the nutrients. But in this situation, what happened is they incorporated non-fully composted bark mulch. And so that bark mulch has not been broken down. And so what's happening is the microbes in this soil are robbing the nitrogen in the soil to try to break down the bark mulch. And so basically the nitrogen is totally tied up in the soil and the plants can't access it. And so that's something that we need to be aware of when we incorporate certain things, that we create a soil environment where the microbes are using the nitrogen for our crop. So a lot of times we have situations, and maybe we have applied the fertilizer, but it's just not available to the plant for other reasons. One of the last things that I would consider that you need to do is you need to think about checks or controls when you're doing fertilizer practices. Just because your neighbor uses it does not mean it's going to work. And a lot of people say, well, it just costs me $1 or $2 per acre, but you have 30 acres. So that adds up if you're spraying, 6 times a year. And how can you recommend it when it might help? And so I would really, really caution you and encourage you that when you use a new product, don't treat your entire field. Do a half a row and leave a half a row that you don't treat. Make sure that this $1 or $2 that you're spending is doing some good. I get amused at what I call snake oil products at times. Humic acid. Humic acid has been touted for years. And the amount that they tell you to apply on some of these products is like a quart per acre. A quart per acre. There's 43,560 feet in an acre. And you're putting 1 quart over that entire acre. It's like taking a teaspoon of salt and putting it into the ocean. So you need to be aware of that. You need to check these things out. Don't assume that it's going to work. And so if you check these things out, you leave a check or a control, then you're going to know, yeah, this money that I'm spending here is doing me some good. I had a situation where I was working with some organic farmers. We were trying to grow organic spinach. And so they were applying compost, and then they were coming back with chicken pellets. And I said, well, we need to use a check on the compost, because they started using compost on their conventional acres. And they put it on all the acres, and I could not give them to leave a check. And so they never really knew that that compost was doing any good. Today in their organic operation, they've gone away from the compost, and all they're using is the chicken pellets. And so I'm really telling you, it's real important to check yourself out. Don't assume that just because you heard good things that it's going to be absolutely the greatest thing that you've ever applied to your fields. So my last picture is this one, and then we'll stop and take questions. Is you need to maintain a good soil water environment. I mean, you can't have too much water. You have to have oxygen, so you want to avoid the really wet, dry situations. A lot of times we have good soil moisture, and then we get critically wet, too wet. And so that's a nice thing with drip irrigation is you can apply water on almost a daily or every other day basis. And so you keep a very uniform water situation, which is very applicable to good plant growth. You want to do a soil test about every 3 to 5 years, not something that you need to do every year. I mean, you need to get good baseline data, and then as you add nutrients, as you add compost or whatever, you're going to build up your soil. And so you're going to create a situation where you may not need certain things. So about every 3 to 5 years will get you where you're at on your baseline. Avoid high amounts of nutrients. Don't just sling out a slug of stuff out there. Small, frequent amounts are far superior to a large lump sum of a nutrient. If possible, ban phosphorus and potassium is what I meant to say there for most efficient use. If you can ban nitrogen, you know, when you side dress, that's good too. But also if you can incorporate this nitrogen into your water, if you can inject it into your water, you're going to get a lot better use of nitrogen than if you just sling it out there. And lastly, only use foliar fertilizers to correct micronutrients. You know, don't go overboard on these foliar fertilizers, because I really think you spend a lot more money than you get good out of that particular situation. So with that, I am going to stop sharing, and we will go ahead and open it up for any questions that you may have.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Stein. That was great.
Thank you.
We have any questions?
Do you recommend humic acid for just like a larger scale? Like if you were put it on your cornfield, would that be useful?
So the question is about humic acid. Would I recommend using it on a cornfield? And I personally would not. I would not spend the money on humic acid. I would do a soil test. I would put out the recommended situation. I would side dress nitrogen when you cultivate it, and see how that comes out. If I was going to try humic acid, I would want to leave a check. I would want to leave a check. But no, I have not seen a tremendous amount of benefit from humic acid, and we've put it out on a lot of different crops. Typically, it has not made that much of a difference.
Okay, because well, never mind.
Uh-oh. Are you having trouble, Andrew? I think we lost him.
Hey, I have a question. What should you do if you did put that mulch in your bed?
Okay, the question is about the uncomposted bark mulch in the bed. What do we do to counteract that? What you need to do is you need to apply nitrogen, high rate of nitrogen, to try to break down that mulch. And it may be that you have to avoid that bed for a year or two so that it totally breaks down, and then it should be okay again. In that raised bed situation, it may be a situation where they take that out, start over. We have a lot. One more time, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I said also I have a very high alkaline content here in the soil and in the water. So does the ammonium sulfate help with that?
That is correct. You have a high pH, so it means you have a lot of calcium, and so ammonium sulfate over time will help with lowering soil pH. But if you're extremely high, it's not going to help that much. So organic matter helps, but you got to realize the only way it's going to help is if the organic matter you apply comes from an acid soil, acid area. So if you,
It's working. Yeah, it's working okay.
good.
It's growing vegetables.
Good. Usually vegetables can tolerate high pH. High pH is not that big an issue except for like beans. Bean crops have an issue, and then you have to side dress iron chelate, EDDHA. But other vegetable crops, typically high pH is not an issue.
All right.
We've got a question in the chat from Robert. He says, what is the ideal composition of soil for raising vegetables?
And so I assume we're talking nutrition, or we could be talking soil, oxygen, water properties as well. So typically, an ideal situation would be have 50% pore space, and 25% of that would have water if we're looking at the composition of the soil itself, is what I would say.
Okay.
My question was also on pH and solubility of the nutrients. Our soil and water here is 7.4, 7.8. I don't attempt to grow plants that are so-called acid-loving, but I wonder about accumulating certain elements in the soil in my beds because the pH is so high.
And so I'm not 100% sure of your question.
Okay, if I'm accumulating iron, for instance, the other person asked about using the sulfate,
Right?
ammonium sulfate. That would help?
That does help lower soil pH. That's correct. That's
okay,
correct.
so that would be my help with my pH issue here.
Yeah.
And your direction to put the phosphorus and potassium 2 to 3 inches below where the seeds are going to be would also help, since they're not terribly water soluble to start with.
That is correct.
Okay,
Exactly right.
thank you.
Exactly right. You're fortunate. 7.4 is not a bad pH. When you get above 7.8 is usually when we see the big issue. So you're right there at the borderline. So ammonium sulfate should help you keep it down. So that's
Thank
good.
you.
You bet.
Any more questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Stein, I'll ask one for, we've done a little bit of this in our Master Gardener demo garden with foliar testing for nutrients. Do you recommend that? How often would be good? That would be more in a commercial setting, but can you talk a little bit about that?
So when you say foliar testing, I mean, what do you, I mean, you're testing to see if they work or?
Yeah, just for nutrients for fertility.
So which ones have you applied?
We did it for tomatoes, and oh goodness, it's been a while. But it did help to know how much nitrogen we needed to add. It was kind of interesting.
So, I mean, what you're saying is you saw an effect from applying them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, yeah, foliar fertilizers can help, but I only see.
Oh no, foliar testing.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
My brain was in the wrong place. Yeah. So, yeah, you can fine tune things with testing nutrients, absolutely. And there's people in certain parts that swear by doing that. I mean, I would do it limitedly, and maybe if you're having issues, but I wouldn't go overboard on it.
Okay.
One year, I worked with a pecan grower, and we sampled his leaves every 2 weeks. And so he was trying to apply based on what he was getting back. It didn't work. And so in your situation, I mean, I'm saying maybe once or twice, once a year, so that you know how you did is good. I don't think doing it more than that is necessary.
Okay.
So yeah, foliar testing of it for nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good practice. Good practice, absolutely.
All right, I don't see any more questions.
I'd like to ask a question if y'all can hear me clearly.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Dr. Stein, have you noticed any of these additives that are recommended for root development or enhancement or anything like that to be effective or worthwhile?
I have not seen any of the different root ones that I can say did a great deal of good. We worked with some mycorrhiza a few years ago and did a randomized replicated trial and put it out there. And it turns out that when you fertilize, typically the mycorrhiza didn't do any good. Now I know there's other root additives as well, but in all the stuff I've done, I've never seen a benefit to using them.
I've used some gibberellic and have noticed a little bit of a bonus from that. Have you done any studies to see if it is really significant or if it's
So
if it's worthwhile?
when you use gibberellic acid, though, you were spraying the plant, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, we see that on certain crops, like on
Strawberries and cantaloupes.
one more time. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. On strawberries and cantaloupes, we have noticed difference.
Yeah, you do get some benefits with gibberellic acid on certain crops. No question about it. Spinach, you get more upright growth, so it's easier to cut. So, I mean, different crops, there is a benefit for using those. I have not used it on strawberries or cantaloupe, though.
We've got one more question in the chat. Should I do soil testing before planting pecans? What would be the best soil composition for planting pecans?
I would do a soil test for pecans just to see what you got. The main thing about a soil composition for pecans is that it drains well. And so we tell you to do the post hole test, 8 to 10 inches wide, 3 feet deep if you have 3 foot of water, 3 foot of soil. Pour in 5 to 7 gallons of water and see how long it takes to drain out. We want the hole to be empty in less than 12 hours. And you want to do this when the soil is wet. So soil drainage is the most important key for pecans.
All right. Well, we'll take a quick break before our next speaker at 11 if you need to run, get another cup of coffee or something. So thank you, Dr. Stein. Appreciate you being on here today. Learned a lot. Thanks.
Absolutely. Y'all have a great day.